Favorite Classics Retold by David Henry Wilson.
James M. Barrie, Peter Pan. Have you ever heard of Peter Pan, the little boy who never grew up? Of course you have. He is very beautiful, sometimes a bit selfish, and sometimes a bit too pleased with himself, but you can't help loving him. Lots of children have dreamt of him, but not many have actually seen him, and even fewer have flown away and lived with him in Neverland. This is the story of 3 children who did. Their names were Wendy, John, and Michael Darling, and they lived with their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Darling, and their dog Nana, in a nice house in London. It all began one evening when the children were in bed, and Mrs. Darling and Nana were sitting by the fire in the living room. Mrs. Darling fell asleep and was dreaming of Neverland, when suddenly the window blew open, and through it flew Peter Pan himself. He was accompanied by a strange light, which dashed round the room so fast that you couldn't see what it was. Nana started barking, and Mrs. Darling woke up just in time to see the little boy and the bright light flying out of the window, with Nana chasing them. Although they escaped, the dog closed the window, and Peter Pan's shadow was caught in it. Mrs. Darling didn't know what to do with the shadow, and so she rolled it up and put it in a drawer. What would you do if you lost your shadow? You'd go and look for it, wouldn't you? And that's just what Peter did. A few nights later, he flew in with the bright light, and it was she who found the shadow. Who was the bright light? She. A tiny girl fairy called Tinker Bell, who loved Peter almost as much as he loved himself.
Here it is, Peter,
she tinkled as she opened the drawer. Her voice was like tiny bells, and only Peter could understand what she said.
Good. Now I can stick it back on,
said Peter, and fetched some soap from the bathroom. Have you ever tried sticking things with soap? If you have, you'll know that soap doesn't stick, and that is why Peter sat on the nursery floor and began to cry. And his crying woke Wendy. She knew who he was, but all the same she was surprised to see him.
What are you crying for?
She asked.
Because the soap won't stick my shadow on,
sobbed Peter.
Of course it won't. Soap doesn't stick. You need to sew it on. Come here and I'll do it for you.
She fetched a needle and thread, and as she sewed, he told her all about Neverland, where he lived with the lost boys. They were boys who had fallen out of their prams.
Aren't there any girls?
Asked Wendy.
No. Girls are too clever to fall out of their prams.
By the time Wendy had sewn the shadow on, and Peter had finished telling her about the mermaids in the lagoon, the tribe of Indians led by Princess Tiger Lily, the pirates led by the terrible Captain James Hook, and the Tick-Tock crocodile, you'll learn about them all later, Wendy wanted nothing more than to go to Neverland herself.
Then fly away with me, Wendy, and be our mother,
urged Peter.
I can't fly. I'll teach you. May I bring John and Michael?
Of course. Then Wendy woke John and Michael, and Peter fetched Tinker Bell, who had accidentally got shut in the drawer, and away they all flew to Neverland. They didn't even say goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Darling, which was very naughty of them, but perhaps they knew that their parents would never have let them go. Peter, Tinker Bell, and the Lost Boys lived in a huge room under the ground. They entered it through a hole in a tree which was just big enough for each of them to squeeze through, but was far too small for their enemies, the pirates, to enter. Unfortunately, it was also too small for Wendy, because although she was only a little girl herself, she was a lot bigger than all of them. Perhaps that was why, the moment they saw her, all the boys rushed up to her and asked her to be their mother.
"But I'm too young to be your mother," she said. "You don't have to be our real mother,"
they cried.
"We only want someone to take care of us."
Since Wendy liked the idea of being a mother, she agreed. Then they all set to work fetching leaves and branches, and before long they had built her a beautiful house right by the tree with the hole in it. That night, Peter and the Lost Boys sat round her, and she told them the story of Cinderella. Then they lined up to kiss her good night, climbed through the hole in the tree, and went happily to bed, together with their new friends John and Michael. Life was fun in Neverland until one day they were all playing by the Mermaid's Lagoon, when suddenly everything went dark. And yet it wasn't night. There were strange sounds in the distance. A song, perhaps, but rough and harsh, and the mermaids, who had been lying on a big rock in the middle of the lagoon, dived into the water and disappeared.
"Pirates!"
cried Peter.
"The pirates are coming! Go home, all of you!"
Michael, who was very small and not very brave, began to cry. John, who was not so small, said he wasn't afraid of pirates, but Wendy knew he was. She made them both go with the other boys, while she hid behind a bush with Peter. He was not afraid at all. In fact, he was smiling. Soon a rowing boat came into view. In it were 2 pirates and a beautiful Indian girl who had been tied up.
"It's Tiger Lily," whispered Peter. "They've caught her, and now they're going to leave her on the rock." "Why?"
asked Wendy.
"Captain Hook hates her. He fell in love with her, and she rejected him because she doesn't like bad people. What will happen to her? When the tide comes in, the water will cover her, and she'll drown. Then we must save her, of course."
And then Peter did the strangest thing. He cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted in a deep voice that Wendy had never heard before. "Ahoy there, you 2! Ahoy there!" The pirates looked at each other in amazement. It was the voice of Captain Hook. "Set the girl free!"
"But Captain, you told us to put her on the rock."
"I've changed my mind. Cut her loose, or you'll feel the sharpness of my hook." The pirates cut the ropes that bound Tiger Lily, who dived into the water, swam ashore, and made her way back to the Indian camp.
"You see how clever I am," laughed Peter. "I can imitate anyone and anything. When Hook hears what's happened, he'll be furious. But he'll guess it was me, and he'll come looking for me."
What surprised Wendy most was that Peter was smiling again. He didn't seem to mind if Captain Hook came looking for him.
"Aren't you afraid of him?" she asked. "No, he's afraid of me. There are only 2 things he's afraid of, me and the crocodile. Why? Because I'm beautiful and he's ugly, and I'm good and he's bad, and everyone loves me, but everyone hates him. Whenever he sees me, I remind him of what he should have been." "And why does he hate the crocodile?" "Because it bit off his hand, which is why he has a hook. And the crocodile enjoyed his tasty hand so much that it now follows him wherever he goes. Luckily for him, the crocodile once swallowed a clock, and so when Hook hears the tick-tock of the clock, he knows the crocodile is near, and he can escape."